Our next speaker is Katherine Franke, who is the James Dohr Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia. She's among the nation's leading scholars writing on law, sexuality, race, and gender-based equality. She's the founder and faculty director of the ERA Project and the Law, Rights, and Religion Project. Those are law and policy think tanks that develop academically rigorous research on gender-based justice and the complex ways in which religious liberties act with other fundamental rights. The most recent book is called Repair, Redeeming the Promise of Slavery's Abolition. Came out in 2019. It makes the case for racial reparations in the United States, and that is her topic today. That is the segue to welcoming back to the APS, Katherine Franke.
Thank you, Linda. It's great to see you, albeit remotely. I'm a little inclined to yield my time back to Dr. McCormick. That was such an interesting presentation. I will do my best to keep his energy level going. It's one of the wonderful things about the APS is we can pivot from that kind of work to legal history in the United States. I just want to thank the APS for inviting me to come talk about this work. And if I can, I wanted to share a few slides just to kind of get us familiar with the people and places I want to talk about. So this is the book, and I will say it's coming out in paperback in June with a reader's guide for high school and college students or reading groups, recovering this history of reparations in the United States. Reparations specifically for enslavement has been a passion of mine for some time. And part of what has motivated me to dig so deep into these histories are three fundamental questions that I would hope would frame our discussion this afternoon. The first has to do with what kinds of moral demands history makes on us today, particularly with respect to the enslavement of human beings. But also, I think, in the context, and slavery may be one of them, where there are ruptures that can't be repaired fully. You may recall that Oedipus does not get his eyes back, and slavery may be quite similar for us. So what does inadequate repair for such a profound form of human horror look like, and what kinds of demands does a re-knowing and retelling of that history make on us today? So that's the first question. The second one is to think hard about the ways in which the relegation of slavery to a past that we kind of lock away has the effect, or perhaps purpose, of perpetuating white innocence. And here I think very often you hear politicians and others say, well, that was a long time ago. You know, my parents didn't own slaves. No one in my family did. Somehow it has no relationship to me. And the book and the work that I do tries to answer that question of why this history relates to all of us. And if we don't face it, it has the exonerating effect, I think, of all of us today, particularly what historian David Scott described to me the other day is this idea of a disowned past, of disassociating ourselves from this past helps exonerate those of us today who don't want to see or take any responsibility for this history. The third fundamental question for me in visiting this material and this time is to ask whether there's any necessary relationship between emancipation and freedom. That is to say, is freedom the opposite of enslavement? And I think this history tells us quite clearly that there is no necessary relationship between emancipation and freedom, because the evidence shows us that being freed is not the same thing as being free. And it's in recognizing this gap between emancipation and real freedom that I think is the remaining work we have to do as a project of reparations so that contemporary Black freedom can even be possible. So to talk about this topic, I always feel very compelled to bring the people I'm talking about into the room, or the virtual room, as is the case here. So this is a population of enslaved people in the Sea Islands of South Carolina, and it forms a good part of the book of talking about their experiences of both enslavement, but also the magnificent moment of emancipation. So in July of 1861, Northern troops landed in the Sea Islands and occupied them. The white enslavers fled immediately to the mainland, entreated what they described as their best servants to come with them. They all refused. They said, we're going to try our luck with this new group of white people, rather than the ones that we've lived with before. And so by virtue of occupying this land, the Northern military legally emancipated these people. Their conditions did not change considerably from one day to the next, but their legal conditions certainly did. Now, among the first things that the Northern military officials did in the humanitarian project of attending to the needs of the formerly enslaved people, people who were sick, were hungry, were unclothed, were needy in a wide range of ways, but as you can see in this photograph, are also incredibly fierce people. This is a group of folks who understood themselves as family and kin, who through the horrors of enslavement, where families would be separated, husbands and wives would be sold, children would be sold, complex kinship units would form, and they all understood each other as part of the same family. But the first thing these military officials did, or one of the first things, was to ask them, what do you want? What does freedom mean to you? And they were very articulate. And it actually is quite a marvel that white military officials would actually do this, would sit and ask them rather than just tell them what it was that was going to happen next. So among the things they heard is this idea of what is the use of giving us freedom if we can't stay where we were raised and own our own house where we were born, and our own piece of ground. Home, land, a place was hugely important to them and fundamental to any idea of freedom. And here is just an incredible photograph of formerly enslaved people in the Sea Islands at that very time. Similarly, another group in Beaufort, South Carolina, they said to the Northern officials, the way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and to turn it and till it by our own labor. We want to be placed on land until we're able to buy it and make it our own. Very clear and consistent message from the enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, is that land and a place to live on, and most notably, the absence of white people, was essential to what they felt they needed in order to not just be freed, but to be free. So Rufus Saxton, who was the general charged with administering to the humanitarian project that was this transition from enslavement to hopeful freedom in the Sea Islands, heard this. He understood that some form of reparation in the form of land was owed the formerly enslaved people of the Sea Islands. And he actually used the term reparation. We think of that as a modern term, but it was one that was used quite regularly in this period as an obligation that was owed to people who had been enslaved in a backward looking sense, in the sense of some kind of recognition of the horror, the rape, the murder, the whippings, the torture, the selling of your family, never mind the extraction of labor without compensation that was slavery, but also a forward-looking requirement that a people emancipated into a state of abject poverty with no place that they could call their own would never be free. And he sent this message clearly to Washington and put this plan into place in 1861, 1862, long before the Emancipation Proclamation or this, later 13th Amendment. And here he understood the people of the Sea Islands as having a foreclosed mortgage on this land that was owed to them. And so this project of providing reparations in the form of land, he undertook pretty immediately after he had taken over the responsibility for administering to the humanitarian needs of the formerly enslaved people. What the US Congress did was pass a bill that taxed the former plantation owners in this area and also throughout the South. And if those taxes were not paid, the land would be seized by the federal government. Now, of course, no Confederate, no one who had left the Union was going to pay taxes to the Union. And so all of this land in the Sea Islands was seized by the federal government, and Saxton's plan, collaborating with the freed people of this area, was to divide the land up and to provide it to them explicitly as reparations. And that's what happened. Here we see a document from the National Archives that was a title or a land claim filed by a group of people like that complex family we saw earlier in a few years later, in January of 1864, for the Fripp plantation. They were making a claim and then filing these claims in the land office to the land on which they'd been born and their ancestors were buried. Notably, Black people could not read or write. It was a crime to teach them to read or write, so they had to sign their names with an X. These marks, these X's, were not only the first acts of freedom that the Black people of the Sea Islands undertook, it was actually the first thing that they did as human beings, no longer property, but persons. And I have to say, as I opened up these documents in the National Archives, some of them not having been opened since they were put in the archives or put into a box in the 1860s, sometimes a hair would fall out. You would feel the presence of the people who were signing these documents and inaugurating a new identity as free people. And I just want to share with you some of the specifics. This is an enlargement of this document. Now, of course, the Saxton's people were writing their names, but their X's bear witness to this transition in their identity. And also you would see at times that perhaps a shaky hand had gotten ink on the hand or on the fingerprint, and you could see a smudge where the X had been, bearing again witness to this important moment. So here's another claim filed by the people who had lived on the Pleasant Point plantation in Ladies Island in the Sea Islands. And you'll see they drew a map of the property to which they were laying claim, not in some perfect rectangle, like many other parts of the country. The West was being plotted at that very time, but according to the terms that meant something to them: the burying ground camp, the pasture field, the Black Horse Creek. And you'll also note that Tom Gillison, Adam Green, Mary Brown, Nancy Wilson, they're putting their names and their X's on property. And women, Black women, are getting title to property at a time when white women could not own property in this state. Right? Women generally, white women generally, were incapacitated from owning property in their own names, but the federal government was recognizing the rights of Black women to own property, which is just a fact worth noting in terms of the radical nature of this project. And then again, on another document, look at how they showed who they were through their marks. They weren't just X's, but they were squiggles, they were circles. There's the presence of human beings being free in new, and I can't imagine what this must have been like for them to get this land and then be told, begin planting, build homes, this land is yours, right? So at the very same time that this is going on, President Lincoln is signing the Homestead Act that allowed for the allocation of land in the West, the opening up of the West to white settlement. Overwhelmingly, white people made claims under the Homestead Act where they could get title for significant size properties, up to 160 acres of land, as compared with the 40 acres that we usually hear about in terms of reparations, if they lived on it for 5 years and paid a small fee. So the Black people of the Sea Islands and elsewhere who had just been emancipated were being allocated land, while the federal government was also allocating land to white people in much larger plots and in a much larger area of the United States out west. Fast forward a little bit, President Lincoln is assassinated. Andrew Johnson becomes president. One of the first things he does in office is grant amnesty to the former Confederates. And if they're willing to sign an ironclad oath, their citizenship in the United States is restored, and all of their property, except in slaves, is restored to them. And thus begins a process of stealing all of this land that had been allocated in title to the freed people of the Sea Islands from them and returning it to their former owners. And not only that, the Black people were discouraged from leaving the Sea Islands because they wanted a ready labor source to work that land. So they were then forced, if they stayed, to enter into year-long labor contracts with the people who had formerly enslaved them. Meanwhile, the West again is being settled by white people through the Homestead Act. 1.5 million families, white families, made claims under the Homestead Act. 246 million acres, 10% of the landmass at that time of the United States, was allocated basically for free to white people who were willing to work that land, while Black people were becoming sharecroppers, contract laborers, and we bear witness, I think, in this distinction of the difference between being freed and being truly free. So if we trace this history of land as an asset, land as a place where you call home, we can see part, at least a significant part, of this intergenerational racial wealth gap that we hear so much about. White people have been able to profit enormously, white families, from the 1860s to now, through the ownership of land. Sit on the land, let the value increase, and you have a ready asset and wealth in your family. Black people never got in on that deal. So not only did they not share in the American dream, they never really got reparations that were meaningful for the horror of enslavement, and were freed into a state of basically second-class intergenerational peasantry. Right. So we can see this in the idea in the data that shows that white families have up to 10 times more wealth in their families than do Black families in the United States. Now, I want to return to the Pleasant Point plantation, that one that was that little bean-shaped property that the freed people got title to. It is now a seniors gated community. All white people live there. This is their lovely website, and they have a little about us and history. No mention that this was actually a plantation. No mention that Black people were enslaved here. No mention that they were granted title to this land. No mention that that land was stolen from them, and that they were then forced back into a slave-like relationship with the former white owners. So I've been talking to the owners and the management of the Pleasant Point plantation about changing this history, because if we don't know it and we don't include it in things like this kind of website, it exonerates, at least in their own minds, the people who live there now. They don't feel any responsibility for the history of the place on which they live. Instead, they can tell a kind of nice story about Tuscarora Jack, an Irishman, and other kinds of things like that, that are lovely historical stories, but don't include the real facts. So let me stop there, and I would love your questions or your thoughts. I have much more to say about it, but let me stop there.
Katherine, thank you. That was really deeply enlightening. I mean, I'm sitting here in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, having grown up myself in New England and having been taught that slavery was a problem in the South and the North had nothing to do with it. And only as an adult and embarrassingly recent years have I learned that the economy of the North really was dependent on the existence of slavery, and that there actually were enslaved people here in peaceful little Stockbridge, Massachusetts. So your focus on the Sea Islands, where people may recognize Hilton Head Resort and a lot of fancy places down there, you zero in on that. In your view, how kind of universal is the inheritance of all of us as Americans in how much ownership are we obliged to claim, no matter where we're from and where we live, of the Sea Island history that you drilled down on?
Well, I mean, the Sea Islands is not a unique story. The part of the book also talks about an area just outside of Vicksburg, Mississippi, where a similar experiment, if you will, in Black freedom and reparations took place. And then that land was also taken back. Some of that land was taken back by the Mississippi River, which ran it over at some point. But as you say, Linda, this is not just a Southern problem. I'm up in the Catskills right now, and there is a slave burial ground not far from here. We had slavery in New York State as well. It's not maintained the way that the white burial grounds are, which is itself an interesting comment on the humanity of Black people. But the United States economy, the United States itself, was built on the institution of slavery. Without the institution of slavery, we would not have had a country. We would not have had an economy. We would not have become the most powerful economy in the world. The cotton trade was an enormously profitable business, as other scholars have studied, and then the trade in slaves themselves, of enslaved people. After the transatlantic slave trade was banned by the Constitution, was also a very profitable business. Part of what I also talk about in the book is that this property, particularly in the Sea Islands, that we all know is now this beautiful Hilton Head and those other areas that are very exclusive and very expensive areas, a lot of the land during this period that I'm writing about, 1863, 4, and 5, ended up getting bought by white industrialists, Guggenheims, Rockefellers. Mark Sanford, the former governor of South Carolina and senator from South Carolina, has one of the plantations that he calls the family farm. There's a collective, not just regional, but national story of how that land ended up in the hands of white people, rather than in the hands of the people to whom it was promised as reparations. And to the extent that white supremacy frames my life as much as it does people of colors, it gives me a wind at my back. It has allowed me to be in a place where I am, to some degree, the beneficiary of the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth right now that we're seeing that's ever happened on the planet. That's because of property ownership and the advantages or the wages of whiteness. So I think we all are implicated in this, not just those who enslaved people or those who lived in that area.
So going forward, I don't know whether your book sketches out, once we have the knowledge, what we do. What's the next step here?
Well, there are a lot of next steps. There's a bill in Congress, HR 40, based on 40 acres and a mule, passed the House, and it's now in the Senate Judiciary Committee, that would create a commission to study reparations. For the first time since it's been introduced in Congress for over 30 years, it's finally getting a hearing and may actually get passed. It doesn't create reparations, it just creates a commission to study it. One of the things I recommend that we do is increase the estate tax. we have one of the lowest estate taxes that we've had in this country's history. And it allows for the intergenerational holding of wealth, which is actually violates a very fundamental American value, I think, of nobility in the United States. But even if we increase the estate tax just a little bit, we could capture an enormous amount of wealth that could go into a fund to pay for reparations. And part of what I recommend is that we fund community land trusts. There are interesting examples of community land trusts across the country in cities like Jackson and Detroit and Baltimore, and even in New York City, close to where I teach, there are community land trusts. And the land is then held by the community in trust for the community, and the community is invested in building out these new neighborhoods, new housing, new schools. And so doing that in Black communities doesn't just enrich the Black community, it also empowers the Black community. So these land trusts, I think, in a nice way, kind of mirror what it was people in the Sea Islands were looking for in the 1860s.
We have a question from Philip Kitcher. As you think about the difference between emancipation and freedom, I wonder whether Isaiah Berlin's famous distinction between negative and positive freedom might help. Your story of the enlightened brigadier seems to be a first venture in going beyond correcting invasions of negative freedom and giving the former slaves a small part of the positive freedom that they never had. Should we think of reparations in terms of continuing that direction and setting up opportunities that contemporary people have lost as a result of slavery?
Well, it's nice to hear from Philip. I hope you're well. I hope you're safe. He's a colleague of mine at Columbia, and or has been over time. I actually think that Berlin's distinction between negative and positive rights helps us think about what the tools are for doing, taking up the issue of reparations at this point, more than a justification for reparations themselves. You know, the US stands almost alone in having this exclusively negative conception of rights, that one's rights are really against state encroachment, of keeping the state at bay. And it's in these non-state settings in civil society that real freedom can flourish. And in Europe and in the UN system, the international human rights system, there's a really robust idea of positive rights, of basic entitlements that all of us have. But that should be true whether we've had a history of slavery or not. We should all enjoy positive rights. And they certainly would be an important tool or form of argument for delivering particular forms of reparations in this context.
Time for one more question is from William Newsom. What form of reparation do you advocate? And then he says, as I write, you're talking about land trusts. Are there others? What would make a real and lasting difference in the lives of descendants of formerly enslaved people? And I guess I'll maybe elaborate a bit on that. Would you require that eligibility be based on descent from slavery rather than race itself?
Yeah, this is a huge debate in the reparations world. There are some groups that argue very strongly that perhaps first or maybe only the people who can show a genetic descendants to an enslaved person are entitled to reparations. I think that raises some problems just of proof, is that tracing your ancestry back for most Black people is impossible. Because enslaved people didn't have their own names, records were not kept, there is no DNA. So doing that tracing and limiting the pool of people who are entitled to reparations to a biological relationship, I think would undercapture, even on the terms that group prefers, would undercapture those who would have an entitlement. My own view is that we should not limit reparations only to those who can show that descendancy to an enslaved person, that the badge of inferiority that rendered Black people enslavable in the first place persists. and that reparations are something that are owed to a broader group of Black people than just those who can show that genetic descendancy. I'll say that, Evanston, Illinois, the city and town in which I was born, has now undertaken an interesting project in reparations based on new revenue that the town has with the legalization of recreational marijuana. And they're now inviting Evanstonians Black Evanstonians who have been discriminated in the housing market in Evanston to come forward and get $24,000 or $25,000 basically vouchers to purchase property in Evanston. The complaint is it's not enough. Of course, it's not enough, but it's a start. So there's those measures. I think an apology, knowing our history, monuments. There are a lot of things that can be done in the name of reparations that are not just checks to individuals, investments in historically Black colleges and universities. Those sorts of things are being talked about quite broadly.
Thanks. You've given us a lot to think about. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up and move on, but thank you very much for sharing this with us.
Thank you, Linda. It's great to see you. Take care.